There's nothing quite like losing everything you thought mattered to discover what truly does. When 14-year-old Clara Mae Morrison buried her parents that cold winter of 1889, she thought her world had ended completely. All she inherited was a muddy, worthless lake that everyone in Willow Creek laughed about. Her relatives took the good farmland and left Clara Mae with nothing but swampland and her little brother Samuel to care for. The neighbors said she got cheated. The bank said the land wasn't worth the taxes. But Clara Mae's father had always told her that sometimes the most valuable things are hidden where nobody thinks to look. When 10-year-old Samuel found that old barrel buried in the muddy shore, they discovered he was right. The lake held a secret worth more money than anyone in their small town had ever seen. But would 2 orphaned children be able to keep a fortune that dangerous men had killed for before? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The compass needle trembled in Clara Mae's palm as she held her father's worn brass instrument, its face scratched from years of frontier use. Thomas Morrison had carried this compass through his days as a surveyor, then as a modest farmer, always telling his daughter that true direction came from within, not from the stars above. Now, 3 months after burying both parents beneath the stark wooden crosses in Willow Creek's windswept cemetery, Clara Mae understood what he'd meant about looking beyond surface appearances. She tucked the compass into her apron and pocket and gazed across the lake that everyone called her inheritance, though inheritance seemed too grand a word for 30 acres of cattails and murky water. The morning sun cast long shadows across the prairie grass, and somewhere in the distance she could hear Samuel's voice calling to their old milk cow, Bessie. At 10 years old, her brother still believed that everything would somehow work out, that the adults would fix what had gone wrong. Clara Mae had learned better. The Morrison family had never been wealthy, but they'd been content. Their small cabin sat on a slight rise overlooking the lake, with a vegetable garden that produced enough to see them through the winters, and a few chickens that provided eggs for trading in town. Thomas Morrison had built their home with his own hands, using timber he'd cut from the scattered groves that dotted the prairie. Their mother, Sarah, had made the cabin feel like a palace with her careful needlework and the way she could stretch a pot of soup to feed unexpected guests. Clara Mae still kept her mother's recipe book, a leather-bound collection of family remedies and cooking wisdom that Sarah had compiled over the years. The pages were stained with flour and marked with notes in her mother's careful handwriting. Add extra sage when the wind's from the north, or Samuel likes this with honey, not molasses. Every recipe told the story of their family's humble but loving existence. Back when the worst worry was whether the chickens would lay enough eggs for Sunday breakfast. But that world had vanished with the fever that took both parents within a week of each other. Clara Mae remembered those terrible days with painful clarity, the way her father's strong hands had grown weak, how her mother's gentle voice had faded to whispers. She'd done everything she could, following every remedy in the recipe book. But some things were beyond the power of herbs and prayers. The day after the funeral, Uncle Ezra had arrived from Kansas City with his lawyer and a stack of papers. Ezra Morrison was Thomas's older brother, a man who'd made his fortune in railroad speculation and wore his success like armor. He'd stood in their modest parlor, adjusting his gold watch chain, and explained how things would be. The farmland goes to the family trust, he'd announced, his voice echoing the authority he was accustomed to wielding. Clara Mae, you'll get the lake property. It's what your father specified in his will. He'd made it sound generous, but Clara Mae had seen the smirk he thought he was hiding. Of course, if you find it too much to manage, I'd be happy to purchase it from you. Say $50 for the whole parcel. Even at 14, Clara Mae had understood the insult. The lake property was considered worthless by everyone in Willow Creek, a shallow, reed-choked body of water that couldn't be drained for farming and wasn't deep enough for good fishing. Local folklore claimed it was cursed, the site of some forgotten tragedy from the early settlement days. Most folks avoided it entirely, believing it brought bad luck to anyone who lingered too long on its shores. But Clara Mae's father had loved that lake. He'd spent countless evenings there, teaching his children to identify the calls of different birds, showing them how to read the weather in the ripples on the water's surface. Sometimes, he told Clara Mae, what looks worthless to most folks holds the greatest treasure for those who know how to see. The people of Willow Creek had been kind in their way, bringing casseroles and offering sympathy, but Clara Mae could see the pity in their eyes. Poor little Clara Mae Morrison, stuck with worthless swampland and a young brother to raise. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, their nearest neighbor, had been the most helpful, checking on them regularly and making sure they had enough food. She was a widow herself, having lost her husband to a mining accident 5 years earlier, and she understood the weight of sudden responsibility. "You're stronger than you know, child," Mrs. Patterson would say, her weathered hands gentle as she helped Clara Mae with the more difficult household tasks. "Your parents raised you right, but don't be too proud to ask for help when you need it." The townspeople meant well, but Clara Mae could hear the conversations that stopped when she entered the general store. The whispers about how long 2 children could survive on their own, how Uncle Ezra would probably end up taking Samuel to Kansas City before winter set in. Some folks seemed to be waiting for Clara Mae to fail, not out of malice, but because failure seemed inevitable. Mr. Holloway, the banker, had been particularly persistent in his pessimism. He was a thin, nervous man who seemed to view every transaction as a personal risk to his institution's reputation. When Clara Mae came to town for supplies, he'd shake his head and mutter about property taxes and maintenance costs. "That lakeland doesn't generate any income." "Miss Morrison," he'd explained with the patience one might use with a slow child, "the taxes alone will eat up whatever small inheritance your parents left. You'd be wise to accept your uncle's offer before the debt becomes unmanageable." But Clara Mae had been watching people her whole life, learning to read the subtle signs that revealed their true intentions. She'd noticed how Mr. Holloway's eyes lingered on the land surveys spread across his desk, how Uncle Ezra asked pointed questions about mineral rights and water access. There was something about that worthless lake that interested these men, something they weren't sharing with a 14-year-old girl. Samuel, meanwhile, seemed to thrive on the adventure of their new circumstances. He'd always been curious about everything, the kind of boy who brought home interesting rocks and asked endless questions about how things worked. Their father had encouraged this curiosity, teaching Samuel to use basic tools and involving him in small repair projects around the property. Now, Samuel had appointed himself the man of the house, a responsibility he took seriously despite his young age. He'd wake before dawn to tend to Bessie and check their small chicken coop, then spend his days exploring every corner of their property with the thoroughness of a surveyor. He knew which parts of the lakeshore were firm enough to walk on, where the cattails grew thickest, and which fallen logs provided the best vantage points for watching the wildlife. "Clara Mae," he'd announce over breakfast, "I found 3 new bird nests yesterday, and I think there might be a beaver dam on the far side of the lake. Papa always said we should know our land better than anyone else." Their father had indeed said that, back when knowing their land meant understanding where to plant corn and which pastures provided the best grazing. Now Clara Mae wondered if Thomas Morrison had meant something deeper, something that might explain why he'd been so specific about her inheriting the lake property. The autumn days were growing shorter, and Clara Mae knew that winter would test their resolve. They had enough preserved food to last through the cold months, thanks to their mother's careful preparation and the generosity of neighbors. The cabin was sturdy and well built, designed to withstand the harsh prairie winters. But Clara Mae understood that surviving one winter was only the beginning. They needed a plan for the future, something that would allow them to keep their home and their independence. Late in the evenings, after Samuel had fallen asleep, Clara Mae would sit by the window and study the lake in the moonlight. The water looked different at night, mysterious and somehow deeper than its daytime appearance suggested. Sometimes she thought she could see shapes moving beneath the surface, Though she knew it was probably just cattails swaying in the current, she'd taken to walking the shoreline in the early mornings, before Samuel woke up, searching for something she couldn't quite name. Her father's compass was always in her pocket, its steady presence a reminder that direction was more than just knowing which way was north. Thomas Morrison had been a man of few words but deep thoughts, and Clara Mae was beginning to suspect that his final gift to his daughter was more complex than it appeared. The lake held secrets, she was certain of it. The question was whether those secrets would save them or destroy them, and whether a 14-year-old girl had the wisdom to tell the difference. The weathered, wanted poster lay crumpled in Samuel's small hands, its edges torn and stained with lake water. Black Jack Morrison, the bold letters proclaimed beneath a sketched portrait of a hard-faced man with cold eyes. Wanted for robbery and murder. $500 reward. The coincidence of the surname sent a chill through Clara Mae's spine, though she knew they shared no blood with this notorious outlaw. Samuel had found the poster that crisp October morning while doing his usual exploration of the lakeshore. He'd been following a particularly interesting blue jay when he'd noticed something unusual protruding from the muddy bank, the curved edge of an old barrel, partially buried and green with algae. Most children might have ignored such a discovery, but Samuel Morrison had inherited his father's curiosity along with his stubborn determination. "Clara Mae," he'd shouted, his voice carrying across the water with unusual excitement. "Come quick! You need to see this." She'd found him knee-deep in the cold lake water, struggling to drag the heavy barrel toward shore. The container was old, its iron bands rusted nearly through, but it had somehow remained intact beneath the mud and water. Together they'd managed to wrestle it onto dry ground, Samuel chattering with excitement about what might be inside. Maybe it's supplies from the old fur traders, he'd speculated, referring to the stories their father had told them about the lake's early history. Or maybe someone lost it during a river crossing. Clara Mae had felt less optimistic. Something about the barrel's deliberate burial suggested secrecy rather than accident. When they'd finally pried off the rotted lid, her suspicions had proven correct in ways she'd never imagined. The contents had been carefully wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow protected them from decades of moisture. Gold coins gleamed in the morning sunlight, more money than Clara Mae had ever seen in one place. There were jewelry pieces too, ornate rings, a woman's pearl necklace, and a pocket watch that still ticked despite its long submersion. But it was the papers that had made Clara Mae's hands tremble, along with the wanted poster. They'd found newspaper clippings from 15 years earlier, detailing a violent robbery in Colorado Territory. Black Jack Morrison and his gang escaped with an estimated $4,000 in gold and jewelry from the Silverton Bank, one article reported. Sheriff's posse lost the trail near the state border. Morrison is considered extremely dangerous and should not be approached. Samuel had been fascinated by the treasure, his young mind focused on their sudden good fortune. "We're rich, Clara Mae," he'd exclaimed, holding up a handful of gold coins. "We can buy anything we want now." But Clara Mae's first emotion had been fear. She understood what Samuel, in his innocence, did not, that money obtained through violence brought violence with it. Someone had buried this treasure by their lake for a reason, and that reason probably involved desperate men willing to kill to reclaim it. "Samuel, listen to me carefully," she'd said, gripping his shoulders with more force than she'd intended. "We can't tell anyone about this. Not Mrs. Patterson, not Uncle Ezra, not anyone in town. Do you understand?" Her brother's excitement had dimmed slightly at her serious tone. "But why?" "It's treasure, Clara Mae, like in the stories Papa used to tell us." "Because this isn't a story," she'd replied, gathering the precious items and rewrapping them carefully. "This money was stolen from innocent people, and if word gets out that we found it, dangerous men will come looking for it." Even as she'd spoken, Clara Mae had noticed movement at the edge of her vision, a rider on horseback, too distant to identify but close enough to see. The timing felt ominous. In all her years living by the lake, she'd rarely seen strangers on their property. Now, on the very day they'd discovered the treasure, someone was watching them. She'd quickly covered the empty barrel with brush and led Samuel back to the cabin, the recovered treasure hidden beneath her shawl. Her mind had raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. If that distant rider had seen them with the barrel, if word somehow reached the wrong ears, their quiet life could become a nightmare overnight. That evening, as Samuel played with his carved wooden horse by the firelight, Clara Mae had studied the contents of the barrel more carefully. The horse had been their father's last gift to Samuel, whittled during the long winter evenings when Thomas Morrison's hands had needed something to do besides worry about his failing health. Now the innocent toy seemed to represent everything they had to lose. The gold was real. She'd tested it with their father's small file, the way he'd taught her to check the purity of metal. The jewelry was valuable too, though some pieces showed signs of hasty removal, suggesting they'd been torn from their owners during the robbery. Each item told a story of violence and loss, making Clara Mae's stomach turn even as she calculated their worth. But it was the map that had worried her most. Hand-drawn on sturdy paper and carefully preserved, it showed the lake and its surroundings in detail, with an X marking the exact spot where Samuel had found the barrel. Someone had planned this hiding place, had chosen their property specifically for concealing stolen goods. The map suggested that the treasure's original owners, or their descendants, might someday return to claim it. The newspaper clippings had provided more disturbing details. Blackjack Morrison had been known for his ruthless efficiency and his willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened his operations. His gang had disappeared after the Silverton robbery, leading authorities to speculate that they'd headed for Mexico or California. But if the treasure was here, by the lake, perhaps they'd never made it as far as they'd planned. Clara Mae had spent hours that night staring at the wanted poster, memorizing the outlaw's face. The resemblance to her own family was purely coincidental. Morrison was a common enough name on the frontier, but she'd wondered if that coincidence might prove dangerous if the wrong people made the wrong assumptions. By morning, she'd made her decision. The treasure would remain secret until she could determine the safest course of action. Samuel had been disappointed by her caution, but he'd grudgingly agreed to keep quiet about their discovery. At 10 years old, he was old enough to understand that some secrets were too dangerous to share. But keeping the secret proved harder than Clara Mae had anticipated. When Mrs. Patterson stopped by with a basket of fresh bread, Clara Mae had found herself stammering through ordinary conversation, terrified that her nervousness would give everything away. When Uncle Ezra had sent a letter, inquiring about her decision regarding the property, she'd read threats between every line. Most unsettling of all had been the appearance of strangers in Willow Creek. Jake Wheeler had arrived 3 days after their discovery, claiming to be a traveling merchant interested in buying land for a business venture. He was a tall, lean man with calculating eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. He'd asked pointed questions about the lake property, offering to pay fair market value for land that everyone knew was worthless. It's unusual for a young lady to hold onto property that generates no income, Wheeler had commented during his visit to the general store, his voice carrying clearly to where Clara Mae was purchasing supplies. Sometimes the wise choice is to sell while you still can. The implied threat in his words had been unmistakable. Clara Mae had left the store quickly, her heart pounding with the realization that their discovery had somehow become known. Whether through the distant rider she'd seen, through loose talk in town, or through some other means she couldn't fathom. Their secret was no longer safe. That night, she'd moved the treasure to a new hiding place, burying it beneath the loose floorboard in their parents' bedroom. Samuel had helped without complaint, though she could see the questions in his eyes. He was growing up fast, faster than any 10-year-old should have to. And Clara Mae felt the weight of that acceleration like a stone in her chest as she tucked him into bed. Samuel had asked the question she'd been dreading. "What are we going to do, Clara Mae?" She'd smoothed his hair, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "We're going to be very careful," she'd told him. "And we're going to trust each other, no matter what happens. But even as she'd spoken the words, Clara Mae had known that being careful might not be enough. The treasure had changed everything, transforming their quiet struggle for survival into something far more dangerous. Whatever came next, she and Samuel would face it together, but she was no longer certain that would be enough to keep them safe. Samuel's wooden horse sat motionless on the kitchen table, its painted eyes seeming to watch Clara Mae as she carefully studied the old land records she'd borrowed from the town clerk. The toy horse represented simpler times, evenings when their father's biggest concern had been finding enough scrap wood for his whittling, when Samuel's laughter had filled their cabin without the shadow of fear that now colored everything they did. 3 days had passed since Jake Wheeler's appearance in town, and Clara Mae had spent every waking moment researching their property's history. If dangerous men were interested in their lake, she needed to understand why. The answer, she hoped, lay somewhere in the dusty files that documented every land transaction in Willow Creek since the town's founding. Old Henrik Larsen, the town's unofficial historian, had been delighted to help when Clara Mae had asked about the lake's previous owners. Henrik was a Norwegian immigrant who'd arrived in Willow Creek during its earliest days, and his memory stretched back to events that existed nowhere else but in his mind. "Yeah, that lake has stories," he'd said in his lilting accent, his pale blue eyes growing distant with memory. "Before your papa bought it, the land belonged to Mexican family, the Ortegas. They lost it during the war, you know, when the territory changed hands. Sad business, that?" Clara Mae had pressed for more details, and Henrik had obliged with the thoroughness of someone who rarely had such an interested audience for his historical knowledge. Carlos Ortega, he was a good man, had a daughter, pretty little thing named Elena. During the fighting, when the American soldiers were coming through, Carlos buried something by that lake. Family treasures, maybe documents? Never did find out what happened to him after the war ended. The daughter, she disappeared too. The information had sent Clara Mae's mind racing. If the Ortega family had hidden valuables by the lake during the Mexican-American War, perhaps the treasure Samuel had found wasn't connected to Blackjack Morrison at all. Perhaps the outlaw had simply discovered an earlier hiding place and added his own stolen goods to it, but Henrik's next revelation had complicated matters further. "Funny thing, though," he'd continued, squinting as he searched his memory. "Few years back, maybe 10 or 12, a Mexican woman came through town asking about the Ortega property. Said she was Carlos's granddaughter, looking for family land. I told her about your papa owning it now, but she seemed to think there might be something still buried there. Never saw her again after that." Clara Mae had thanked Henrik and returned home with more questions than answers. If Elena Ortega's descendants were still alive, still searching for their family's hidden treasures, the situation was even more complex than she'd imagined. The treasure wasn't just stolen gold from a bank robbery. It might be a mixture of criminal loot and legitimate family heirlooms, buried together by chance or design. Meanwhile, Samuel had been struggling with his own challenges. Keeping such a momentous secret proved nearly impossible for a 10-year-old boy, especially one whose natural inclination was to share every interesting discovery with his friends. That afternoon, Clara Mae had overheard him talking to Tommy Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's grandson who often played by the lake. "I bet there's all kinds of interesting things buried around here," Samuel had said, his voice carrying that particular tone that Clara Mae recognized as dangerous, the sound of a boy trying to hint at secrets he couldn't directly reveal. "Like what?" Tommy had asked with the skeptical interest of an 8-year-old. "Oh, you know, old bottles, maybe some coins." "Treasure maps," Samuel had replied, each word making Clara Mae's heart race faster. She'd intervened quickly, calling Samuel in for chores, but the damage was already done. Tommy Patterson was Mrs. Patterson's grandson, which meant that any interesting conversation would likely be repeated at the Patterson dinner table that evening. Mrs. Patterson was the kindest woman in Willow Creek, but she was also human, and humans talked. That night, Clara Mae had sat Samuel down for a serious conversation beside the fireplace. where the dancing flames cast long shadows across their modest parlor. "Samuel, I know this is hard," she'd begun, choosing her words carefully. "But you cannot hint about what we found. Not to Tommy, not to anyone. People's lives might depend on our secret." Samuel had nodded solemnly, but she could see the effort it took for him to contain his excitement. He was maturing rapidly under the pressure, his childish enthusiasm tempered by a growing understanding of their precarious situation. Yet he was still fundamentally a 10-year-old boy, and 10-year-old boys weren't designed to carry such weighty secrets. To make matters worse, Jake Wheeler had established himself in town with the persistence of a man who had nowhere else to be. He'd taken a room at Mrs. Henley's boarding house and had begun what he called his preliminary surveys of local property. Each day, Clara Mae could see him riding the boundaries of their land, always careful to stay on the public road, but making his interest unmistakably clear. Wheeler's presence had affected the entire community. Unlike their usual visitors, traveling preachers, circuit judges, or genuine merchants, Wheeler carried an air of barely controlled violence that made even the boldest townspeople uneasy. Children were warned to stay close to home, and women found excuses to avoid walking alone. Clara Mae had decided that information was her best weapon against whatever threat Wheeler represented. If she couldn't match him in physical strength or experience with violence, perhaps she could outthink him. Her first strategic move had been deliberately spreading false information about the lake's worthlessness. During her weekly visit to the general store, she'd made sure to complain loudly about the property's drainage problems to Mr. Jameson, the store owner, knowing that such complaints would spread throughout the community within hours. "I swear that lake gets soggier every year," she'd announced while purchasing supplies, her voice carrying to the other customers. "Papa always said it wasn't good for anything but breeding mosquitoes." I'm starting to think he was right. The performance had felt awkward, but Clara Mae had noticed Wheeler listening from across the store, his sharp eyes evaluating every word. If he was interested in their property for its hidden treasure, perhaps convincing him that the land held nothing valuable would encourage him to move on. But Wheeler's continued presence suggested that he wasn't easily discouraged. If anything, his daily rides past their property had become more frequent, more obviously investigative. Clara Mae had begun to suspect that he knew far more about the treasure than she'd initially assumed. The most unsettling development had been Uncle Ezra's unexpected visit. He'd arrived without warning, claiming that business had brought him through Willow Creek, and he'd decided to check on his brother's children. But Clara Mae had noticed how his eyes lingered on the lake, how he asked casual questions about recent visitors to the area. "That Wheeler fellow seems quite interested in local real estate," Ezra had commented during dinner, his tone suggesting casual conversation, while his eyes remained sharp and calculating. "He asked me several questions about your property." Clara Mae seems to think it might have more potential than folks realize. Clara Mae had kept her expression neutral, but inside she'd felt a chill of understanding. Uncle Ezra's timing was too convenient, his questions too pointed. Either he was working with Wheeler, or he'd heard rumors that had brought him running to protect his own interests in the family land. That night, after Uncle Ezra had retired to the spare room they'd prepared for him, Clara Mae had checked their hidden treasure one more time. Everything remained secure beneath the loose floorboard, but she'd realized that their hiding place was only as safe as their ability to keep it secret. As she'd tucked Samuel into bed, he'd whispered a question that had been haunting her own thoughts. "Clara Mae, what if we're not smart enough to handle this?" She'd kissed his forehead, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair, soap and sunshine, and the innocence that was disappearing too quickly from his childhood. "Then we'll learn to be smarter," she'd promised, hoping that determination would prove to be enough. The rusted pickaxe felt heavy in Clara Mae's hands as she examined the tool she discovered in her father's workshop, hidden beneath years of accumulated dust and forgotten memories. The mining pan beside it bore scratches and dents that spoke of serious use, not the casual prospecting that most frontier farmers occasionally attempted. These were the tools of a man who'd spent considerable time searching for precious metals, and their very existence suggested that Thomas and Morrison had harbored secrets of his own. Clara Mae had found the mining equipment while searching for anything that might help her understand her father's true intentions regarding the lake property. Uncle Ezra's visit the previous week had convinced her that too many people knew too much about their situation. She needed every advantage she could find, including any hidden knowledge her father might have left behind. The discovery had come with a collection of documents tucked into an oilskin pouch, survey maps, mineral rights claims, and letters that revealed a side of Thomas Morrison she'd never suspected. Her father, the quiet farmer who'd taught her about growing vegetables and reading weather patterns, had once been a serious prospector with connections throughout the mining territories. One letter, dated just 2 years earlier, had been particularly illuminating. Written by a geologist named Dr. Marcus Webb from the Territorial Survey Office, it contained technical language about mineral deposits and underground formations that Clara Mae struggled to understand. But one passage had been clear enough to make her hands tremble as she read it. "Thomas, your instincts about the lake property appear correct. The geological formations suggest significant potential for mineral deposits, particularly given the unusual sediment layers you described. I cannot make any official recommendations without a proper survey, but your investment in the property shows considerable foresight." The implications had staggered Clara Mae. Her father hadn't simply bought worthless swampland out of sentiment or stubborn hope. He'd purchased it based on professional geological advice, believing that the lake might conceal valuable mineral deposits. The worthless inheritance was potentially worth far more than anyone in Willow Creek had imagined, but this revelation had also deepened the mystery surrounding Blackjack Morrison's treasure. If her father had known about the lake's potential value, had he also known about the buried gold? The timing seemed too coincidental. A prospector with geological knowledge purchasing land that happened to conceal a fortune in stolen goods. Samuel had proven surprisingly helpful in processing this new information. Despite his young age, he possessed a natural intelligence that Clara Mae was learning to appreciate. When she'd shared the discovery with him, carefully explaining what the documents meant, his response had been immediate and practical. "Papa wasn't just protecting us by leaving you the lake," Samuel had said, his 10-year-old logic cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "He was giving us something valuable that nobody else knew about. Maybe he even knew about the treasure." The possibility had occurred to Clara Mae as well, though she'd hesitated to voice it. If their father had known about the buried gold, why hadn't he recovered it himself? Why leave such a dangerous secret for his children to discover? Samuel's growing maturity under pressure had become both a blessing and a concern. He'd begun displaying strategic thinking that seemed far beyond his years, suggesting elaborate plans for protecting their secret and dealing with the various threats they faced. But Clara Mae worried about the cost of his premature sophistication, watching childhood innocence slip away with each passing day. Their situation had grown more complicated with the arrival of Mary Sullivan, the new schoolteacher who'd come to Willow Creek to replace the elderly Miss Henderson. Mary was a young woman from St. Louis, educated and observant, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made her dangerous to people with secrets. She'd introduced herself to Clara Mae during a visit to the general store, expressing concern about Samuel's recent absences from school and his apparent distraction when he did attend. "Samuel seems like a bright boy," Mary had said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to evaluating children's behavior. "But lately he appears to be carrying some kind of burden. Has something happened at home that might explain the change?" Clara Mae had deflected the questions as diplomatically as possible, but she'd recognized in Mary Sullivan the kind of person who noticed details and drew accurate conclusions. If Samuel's behavior continued to deteriorate under the stress of their secret, the schoolteacher would eventually piece together enough information to become a problem. Yet Mary had also demonstrated qualities that suggested she might become an ally rather than a threat. When Jake Wheeler had made one of his intimidating appearances at the school, asking pointed questions about local families and their property holdings, Mary had firmly refused to discuss her students or their circumstances. "Mr. Wheeler," she'd said with the kind of steel-backed politeness that Clara Mae had witnessed herself, "I find it inappropriate for strangers to inquire about the private affairs of children in my care. Perhaps you should direct your questions to the parents themselves." Wheeler's reaction to this rebuff had revealed another facet of his character. Rather than responding with anger, as Clara Mae had expected, he'd actually seemed amused by Mary's defiance, as if he appreciated encountering someone who wouldn't be easily intimidated. "My apologies, Miss Sullivan," he'd replied, with what might have been genuine respect. "I can see that Willow Creek's children are in capable hands." But Wheeler's momentary courtesy hadn't extended to his treatment of Clara Mae and Samuel. His daily surveillance of their property had escalated into more direct intimidation tactics. He'd begun appearing at unexpected moments, when Clara Mae was hanging laundry, when Samuel was tending to their animals, when either of them ventured toward the lake shore. These encounters followed a pattern that Clara Mae recognized as deliberately psychological warfare. Wheeler would approach with apparent friendliness, making casual conversation about the weather or local events before gradually steering the discussion toward their property and their future plans. His questions seemed innocent enough individually, but taken together they formed an increasingly obvious interrogation. "It's a lonely life for young people," he'd commented during one such encounter, his eyes scanning the lake's surface with obvious interest, "especially during the winter months. Have you given any thought to your uncle's generous offer for the property?" Clara Mae had learned to respond with deliberate vagueness, neither confirming nor denying any specific plans. But she'd also begun carrying her father's mining pickaxe during her daily chores, both as a practical tool and as a subtle warning that she was prepared to defend herself. The psychological pressure had begun affecting both children in ways that concerned Clara Mae deeply. Samuel's nightmares had returned, though he tried to hide them behind forced cheerfulness during the day. She'd found him several times, staring out the window toward the lake, his young face marked by worry lines that no 10-year-old should possess. For her own part, Clara Mae had discovered reserves of determination she hadn't known she possessed. Each new threat, each intimidating encounter seemed to strengthen rather than weaken her resolve. She was beginning to understand that her father's final gift hadn't been just the property itself, but the challenge of proving herself worthy of it. The mining tools had given her an idea for their next strategic move. If Wheeler and Uncle Ezra believed the lake held mineral wealth, she could use that assumption to misdirect their attention away from the actual treasure. By allowing them to discover the mining equipment, she could create a false explanation for their interest in retaining the property. That evening, as she and Samuel prepared for another night of uncertain sleep, Clara Mae had outlined her plan. "Tomorrow, we're going to let Mr. Wheeler see Papa's mining tools," she'd explained. "We'll make it look accidental, like we're just cleaning out the workshop. Let him think we're staying because we believe there's gold in the ground, not because we've already found it." Samuel had nodded with the serious attention he'd begun bringing to all their strategic discussions. At 10 years old, he was becoming her partner in survival rather than simply the little brother she was protecting. But Clara Mae knew that deception, however clever, could only delay the inevitable confrontation that was building around them. The telegraph key's brass lever felt cold under Clara Mae's fingers as she practiced the Morse code sequences her father had taught her years earlier. Thomas Morrison had been one of the few men in Willow Creek who understood the telegraph system, a skill he'd acquired during his prospecting days when communication across vast distances could mean the difference between success and failure. Now, as Clara Mae sat in the dim light of their cabin's single oil lamp, she realized that her father's seemingly random lessons had been preparing her for exactly this kind of crisis. she'd discovered the telegraph key hidden in the same workshop space where she'd found the mining tools, wrapped carefully in the same oilskin that had protected her father's geological correspondence. Along with the key, she'd found a detailed map of telegraph lines throughout the territory and a notebook filled with her father's careful handwriting, call signs for law enforcement offices, emergency procedures, and coded messages that could be sent without alerting local operators to their true meaning. The revelation had been both thrilling and terrifying. Her father had essentially left her the tools to contact outside authorities, but using them would require skills she wasn't certain she possessed and risks she wasn't sure she was prepared to take. The nearest telegraph office was in Willow Creek itself, operated by Mr. Jameson at the general store, which meant that any message she sent would potentially be overheard by the very people she was trying to avoid. But Wheeler's escalating surveillance had convinced Clara Mae that desperate times required desperate measures. That morning, she'd witnessed something that had chilled her to the bone. Wheeler conferring quietly with two other men at the edge of their property. The strangers had the look of professional gunmen, hard-faced and heavily armed, and their presence suggested that Wheeler's patient approach was giving way to something more direct and dangerous. Samuel had seen them too, and his reaction had been immediate and practical. Without being asked, he'd begun implementing the security measures they'd discussed, checking the locations of their emergency supplies, ensuring that their father's service revolver was loaded and accessible, and memorizing the escape routes they'd planned through the cattails and brush surrounding the lake. Clara Mae, he'd said with the matter-of-fact tone he'd adopted for discussing their increasingly perilous situation. I think those men are here to hurt us. She'd wanted to reassure him, to find some comforting explanation for Wheeler's reinforcements. But Samuel's assessment had matched her own fears too closely for comfortable denial. Instead, she'd focused on practical preparations, knowing that their survival might depend on how well they'd planned for the worst-case scenario. The friendship Samuel had developed with Tommy Patterson had become both a blessing and a complication. Tommy was Mrs. Patterson's grandson, which meant that any unusual behavior would be reported to one of the few adults in Willow Creek that Clara Mae trusted completely. But Samuel's need for normal childhood companionship had proven stronger than his ability to maintain perfect operational security. That afternoon, Clara Mae had overheard a conversation between the boys that had made her realize how much their situation was affecting Samuel's psychological state. My sister says we might have to move away soon, Samuel had told Tommy, his voice carrying a sadness that cut through Clara Mae's heart. She says it's not safe here anymore. Why isn't it safe? Tommy had asked with the direct curiosity of childhood. Bad men want to take our land, Samuel had replied, the explanation both truthful and incomplete. Clara Mae says we have to be very careful about who we trust. The conversation had revealed how much responsibility Samuel was carrying and how desperately he needed someone his own age to confide in. Clara Mae had realized that her efforts to protect him were inadvertently isolating him from the normal childhood experiences that might help him cope with their extraordinary circumstances. Her decision to attempt telegraph communication with outside law enforcement had been sparked by a disturbing discovery she'd made while observing Wheeler's daily patterns. Using her father's old surveying telescope, she'd been able to watch Wheeler's meetings with his associates from the concealment of their cabin's upper window. What she'd seen had convinced her that they were running out of time. Wheeler and his men were conducting systematic searches of the lakeshore, working in a grid pattern that suggested professional thoroughness rather than casual exploration. They were looking for something specific, and their methodology indicated that they possessed detailed information about what they hoped to find. Clara Mae had realized with growing horror that Wheeler might already know about the treasure's existence, perhaps even its approximate location. The implications had been staggering. If Wheeler knew about the gold, then their efforts at misdirection had been futile from the beginning. Worse, it suggested that someone, with detailed knowledge of the treasure's history, had provided Wheeler with information that Clara Mae didn't possess herself. Her first attempt at telegraph communication had been a disaster. Of nerves and inexperience, she'd waited until late evening, when Mr. Jameson typically closed the store but left the telegraph equipment accessible for emergencies. Sneaking into town under cover of darkness, she'd attempted to send a coded message to the Territorial Marshal's office requesting assistance with claim, jumpers and threats to property rights. But operating the telegraph equipment had proven more difficult than her father's lessons had prepared her for, and her nervous mistakes had produced a garbled transmission that probably made no sense to whoever received it. Worse, her fumbling with the equipment had taken far longer than planned, and she'd barely escaped the store before Mr. Wheeler had appeared on the street, apparently drawn by the unusual late-night telegraph activity. The failed attempt had taught Clara Mae several important lessons about the risks and limitations of seeking outside help. Any further communication attempts would need to be more carefully planned, with better preparation and a clearer understanding of what kind of assistance she was requesting. Meanwhile, the community of Willow Creek had begun choosing sides in ways that revealed the complex loyalties and interests that govern frontier society. Mrs. Patterson had made her support for Clara Mae and Samuel increasingly obvious, finding excuses to visit their cabin and bringing supplies that stretched their meager resources. Her presence had provided comfort and practical assistance, but it had also made her a potential target for Wheeler's intimidation tactics. Mary Sullivan, the schoolteacher, had proven to be an unexpected source of strength and wisdom. When Clara Mae had finally confided some of their difficulties, carefully edited to avoid mentioning the treasure, Mary had responded with both sympathy and practical advice. Clara Mae, she'd said during one of their conversations, "There are times in life when being young and female seems like an insurmountable disadvantage. But there are also times when people underestimate young women in ways that can be turned to our benefit. Don't let anyone convince you that you're helpless simply because you're 14 years old." The advice had resonated deeply with Clara Mae, who'd been struggling with feelings of inadequacy in the face of their mounting challenges. Mary's words had reminded her that her apparent weaknesses might also be sources of strength, if she could learn to use them strategically. But even Mary's support couldn't change the fundamental mathematics of their situation. Wheeler had more men, more resources, and apparently more knowledge about their circumstances than Clara Mae had initially realized. Her father's preparations had provided tools and knowledge, but ultimately their survival would depend on her ability to outthink opponents who possessed every apparent advantage. As she prepared for bed that night, Clara Mae had made a decision that surprised her with its clarity and determination. Tomorrow, she would make another attempt at telegraph communication, this time with better preparation and a clearer message. But she would also begin implementing the more aggressive defensive measures her father's notebooks had outlined. The time for purely defensive strategies was ending. If Wheeler and his associates wanted a fight, Clara Mae Morrison was prepared to give them one. The silver locket felt warm against Clara Mae's palm as she studied the tiny photograph inside. Her mother's face, young and hopeful, frozen in time before the hardships of frontier life, had etched lines of worry around her gentle eyes. But it was the hidden compartment behind the photograph that had captured Clara Mae's attention, revealed only when Samuel had accidentally dropped the locket and jarred loose a nearly invisible catch. Inside the secret compartment lay a small brass key, tarnished with age but unmistakably purposeful. The discovery had sent Clara Mae's mind racing with possibilities, particularly when she'd remembered her mother's cryptic references to important papers that needed to be kept safe. Sarah Morrison had been a woman of careful planning and quiet foresight, qualities that Clara Mae was learning to appreciate more deeply with each passing day. The key had led them to the first bank of Willow Creek, where Clara Mae had approached Mr. Holloway with a mixture of nervousness and determination. The banker's attitude toward her had grown increasingly patronizing over the weeks since her parents' death. But the sight of the brass key had transformed his expression into something approaching respect. "Your mother was a wise woman," he'd admitted grudgingly, leading Clara Mae to a small safety deposit box that she'd never known existed. She insisted on maintaining this box even when money was tight, said there were some things too important to keep at home. The contents of the safety deposit box had revolutionized Clara Mae's understanding of their family's history and their current situation. Along with official documents like birth certificates and property deeds, she'd found correspondence that revealed her mother's extensive knowledge of the Lake property's complex ownership history. One letter, written in Clara Morrison's careful handwriting and addressed to a lawyer in Santa Fe, had been particularly illuminating. "Mr. Rodriguez, I write regarding the Ortega family claim to the property my husband recently purchased. While the legal title appears clear, I believe there may be moral obligations that transcend legal ownership. If members of the Ortega family should ever inquire about their ancestral land, please inform them that the Morrison family would welcome discussion about equitable arrangements." The implications had staggered. Clara Mae, her mother, had known about the Ortega family's historical connection to the Lake property, had apparently felt guilty about the circumstances that had led to their dispossession, and had been prepared to make amends if the opportunity arose. The letter suggested a level of moral complexity to their inheritance that Clara Mae was only beginning to understand. But the most shocking discovery had been a detailed map, hand-drawn and carefully annotated, showing not only the lake's current boundaries but also the locations of what Clara Morrison had identified as historical artifacts of possible significance to the original owners. The map included the exact spot where Samuel had found the treasure barrel, marked with a small cross and the notation, "Investigated. 1887, contents undisturbed per family wishes." The revelation had left Clara Mae reeling with questions about what her parents had truly known and why they had chosen to keep such momentous secrets. If her mother had been aware of the treasure's existence since 1887, why had they lived in modest circumstances? Why had they allowed Clara Mae and Samuel to believe they were poor when a fortune lay buried steps from their front door? Samuel's reaction to these discoveries had revealed another facet of his rapidly maturing character. Rather than feeling betrayed by their parents' secrecy, he had demonstrated an intuitive understanding of the moral complexities involved. Maybe Mama and Papa knew that money stolen from other people wasn't really ours to spend, he'd suggested with the kind of ethical clarity that sometimes amazed Clara Mae. Maybe they were waiting for the right time to figure out what to do with it. His interpretation had aligned with Clara Mae's growing understanding of her parents' characters. Thomas and Clara Morrison had been people of deep moral conviction, the kind of individuals who would struggle with the ethical implications of possessing stolen goods, even if those goods might solve their financial difficulties. But Samuel's wisdom had also highlighted the irony of their current situation. While their parents had wrestled with moral questions about the treasure, Clara Mae and Samuel were fighting for their lives against men who had no such ethical constraints. The luxury of moral deliberation was disappearing under the pressure of immediate physical danger. The appearance of Elena Martinez had transformed their situation from complicated to extraordinary. She'd arrived in Willow Creek on a Thursday morning, a woman in her 30s with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of quiet dignity that commanded respect. When she'd introduced herself to Clara Mae as Carlos Ortega's granddaughter, the final pieces of the puzzle had begun falling into place. Elena spoke English with only a slight accent, the result of years spent in American schools, but her knowledge of her family's history was comprehensive and precise. She'd brought documents of her own, Spanish land grants, family letters, and genealogical records that established her legitimate claim to the lake property beyond any reasonable doubt. My Grandfather buried our family's gold when the American soldiers came, she'd explained during their first meeting, her voice carrying the weight of generational grief. Not stolen gold, señorita. Our gold earned through honest trade and saved for 3 generations. He hoped to return for it when the fighting ended, but he never got the chance. The conversation had revealed the full complexity of the treasure's origin. Elena's family had been prosperous merchants before the Mexican-American War, with legitimate wealth that they'd hidden to prevent its confiscation by advancing American forces. What Samuel had found wasn't stolen goods from a bank robbery, but the life savings of a family destroyed by war and political upheaval. Elena's presence had also provided Clara Mae with her first real ally in dealing with Wheeler's threats. The Mexican woman had experience with dangerous men and violent situations. Having grown up in a region where political instability had made such encounters common. Men like your Senor Wheeler, Elena had observed after Clara Mae had described their situation. They understand only force and profit, but they also make mistakes when they believe they are dealing with helpless women and children. Together, they had begun planning a strategy that used Wheeler's assumptions about their helplessness against him. Elena's arrival had provided legitimate justification for remaining on the property. If she and Clara Mae were negotiating some kind of arrangement regarding the historical Ortega claim, it would explain their refusal to sell to either Wheeler or Uncle Ezra. But even as they planned their deception, Clara Mae had found herself grappling with questions of justice and ownership that had no easy answers. If the treasure rightfully belonged to Elena's family, what claim did Clara Mae and Samuel have to it? If their parents had known about the Ortega connection, what would they have wanted their children to do? Samuel had seemed less troubled by these moral complexities, perhaps because his sense of right and wrong remained clearer than Clara Mae's increasingly complicated adult understanding of justice. Elena's family lost their gold because of a war, he'd pointed out during one of their discussions. That doesn't seem fair. But we didn't start the war, and we didn't steal their land. Maybe the fair thing is to share. His solution had the beautiful simplicity of childhood wisdom. But Clara Mae wondered whether fairness would matter if Wheeler and his associates decided to take the treasure by force. In the harsh mathematics of frontier survival, moral principles might prove to be luxuries they couldn't afford. The Spanish land grant felt fragile in Clara Mae's hands, its ancient parchment crackling softly as she unfolded the document that Elena had produced from her leather traveling case. The elaborate calligraphy and official seals spoke of a time when the lake property had been part of a vast Mexican rancho, legally granted to the Ortega family by the colonial government decades before American settlers had ever seen this stretch of prairie. Rancho Agua Clara, Elena read aloud, translating the flowing Spanish text. Clear Water Ranch. My great-grandfather named it for the lake, back when the water ran clearer than it does now. Her voice carried the weight of generations, and Clara Mae could hear the pride and loss intertwined in every word. The document changed everything. Clara Mae thought she understood about their situation. This wasn't simply a matter of stolen gold hidden by desperate men. It was a story of legal ownership, family heritage, and the complex injustices that had followed the Mexican-American War. Elena's family hadn't just lost their treasure. They'd lost their entire way of life, but Elena's next revelation had struck Clara Mae like a physical blow. As they sat in the Morrison cabin's small parlor, with Samuel listening intently from his seat by the fireplace, Elena had produced another document that made Clara Mae's blood run cold. There is something else you must know, Elena had said, her dark eyes growing troubled. My grandfather did not work alone when he hid our family's gold. He had help from an American man, a surveyor who had become his friend despite the war. A man named Morrison. The silence that had followed this announcement seemed to stretch forever. Clara Mae had felt the world shifting around her, familiar certainties crumbling as she struggled to process the implications of Elena's words. My papa, Samuel had asked in a small voice, his 10-year-old mind grasping immediately what Clara Mae was still trying to accept. "No, Mijo," Elena had replied gently. "Your grandfather. Thomas Morrison's father, I believe. The man who helped my grandfather hide our gold was named James Morrison. He was working as a territorial surveyor during the war. The family connection had rewritten every assumption Clara Mae had made about their inheritance. Her grandfather, a man she'd barely remembered from her early childhood, had been directly involved in hiding the Ortega treasure. Thomas Morrison hadn't simply purchased land that happened to contain buried gold. He'd bought property he knew contained his own father's legacy. But Elena's story had grown more complex and disturbing as she continued. James Morrison and Carlos Ortega had developed a friendship that transcended the political divisions of their time, bonding over their shared love of the land and their similar values regarding family and honor. When the war had made it necessary for the Ortega family to flee, James Morrison had promised to protect their hidden wealth until they could safely return. "My grandfather gave your grandfather a map," Elena had explained, producing a hand-drawn document that matched perfectly with the notations Clara Mae had found in her mother's papers. But James Morrison died before the war ended, and the knowledge died with him. "My family spent years searching for someone who might know what had happened to him." The tragic irony of the situation had become clear to Clara Mae with devastating impact. Her grandfather had died keeping his promise to protect the Ortega gold, never having the opportunity to return it to its rightful owners. Her father had inherited both the secret and the moral obligation, spending his adult life trying to find a way to honor his father's commitment while providing for his own family. Samuel's kidnapping had occurred while Clara Mae was still processing these revelations. She'd been so absorbed in Elena's story that she'd failed to notice how long her brother had been absent from the cabin. It was only when Eleanor had asked about Samuel's whereabouts that Clara Mae had realized something was wrong. They'd found signs of struggle near the lake shore, scuffed earth, Samuel's hat lying abandoned in the cattails, and most ominously, hoofprints that suggested riders had approached and departed quickly. A note pinned to a nearby tree had confirmed Clara Mae's worst fears. "Miss Morrison, your brother is safe for now. Bring the Ortega gold to the old mill ruins at sunset tomorrow. Come alone, or the boy suffers the consequences." A friend. The crude handwriting and deliberate anonymity hadn't fooled Clara Mae for a moment. Wheeler had escalated from intimidation to kidnapping, and her brother's life now hung in the balance of decisions she felt desperately unprepared to make. But Elena's reaction to the kidnapping had revealed another dimension of her character. Far from being paralyzed by the turn toward violence, she'd responded with the calm efficiency of someone who'd faced similar crises before. "This changes our approach, but not our goals," Elena had stated firmly. "Wheeler believes he can force us to surrender what he thinks he wants, but he doesn't understand what he's truly dealing with." Elena's explanation had introduced the final, most shocking twist in their already complex situation. The treasure Samuel had discovered wasn't just the Ortega family gold. It was only a small portion of a much larger fortune that her grandfather had distributed across multiple hiding places before fleeing the territory. Carlos Ortega was not a foolish man, Elena had explained as they'd planned their response to Wheeler's ultimatum. He knew that hiding all of his wealth in one location would be too dangerous. "The barrel your brother found contains perhaps 1/10 of what our family lost." The implications had staggered Clara Mae. If the discovered treasure was worth $4,000, the complete Ortega fortune might be worth $40,000 or more, enough money to transform not just their lives, but the entire economic foundation of Willow Creek. But Elena's knowledge of the treasure's full scope had also revealed the true reason for Wheeler's persistence. He wasn't simply an opportunistic claim jumper. He was working for someone with detailed knowledge of the Ortega family history, someone who understood the complete scope of what was hidden. "My uncle Rodrigo survived the war," Elena had continued, her voice growing bitter with old pain. "But he changed, became consumed with recovering what we had lost. He spent years hiring men like Wheeler to search for our family's gold, caring nothing for the innocent people who might be hurt in the process. The revelation had completed Clara Mae's understanding of their perilous situation. Uncle Rodrigo Ortega was using Wheeler to recover his family's treasure, but his methods showed no regard for the moral obligations that had bound James Morrison and Carlos Ortega in friendship. The alliance that had once protected the gold had been perverted into a tool of greed and violence. Sheriff Morrison's arrival at their cabin, summoned by Clara Mae's finally successful telegraph message, had provided their first real hope of outside assistance. The sheriff was a weathered man in his 50s, with the kind of steady competence that came from years of dealing with frontier violence. Despite sharing Clara Mae's surname, they were not related, but he'd responded to her coded message about claim jumpers and threats to mining property with the seriousness she'd hoped. "For Miss Morrison," he'd said. After Clara Mae and Elena had explained their situation in carefully edited terms, "What you're describing sounds like a dispute over mineral rights that's gotten out of hand. But kidnapping a child changes this from a civil matter to a criminal one." The sheriff's presence had given Clara Mae renewed hope, but Elena's assessment of their situation remained grimly realistic. Wheeler had chosen the old mill ruins for their exchange, specifically because the location was defensible and remote. Even with law enforcement assistance, rescuing Samuel without bloodshed would require careful planning and considerable luck. As they'd prepared for the confrontation at the mill ruins, Clara Mae had found herself grappling with questions that had no easy answers. How much of their family's history had her parents understood? How many other people knew about the Ortega treasure's true scope? And most importantly, would her attempts to honor her grandfather's promise to Carlos Ortega cost Samuel his life? The final irony of their situation hadn't escaped Clara Mae's notice. In trying to protect what they'd thought was their inheritance, she and Samuel had discovered that they were actually the guardians of someone else's legacy, a responsibility that might prove more dangerous than the treasure itself. The weight of her father's service revolver felt both comforting and terrifying in Clara Mae's hands as she checked the cylinder one final time, ensuring that all 6 chambers held cartridges. The Civil War-era Colt had seen action at Gettysburg, carried by Thomas Morrison through 3 years of bitter fighting before he'd brought it home to the frontier. Now, as Clara Mae prepared for what might be the most important confrontation of her young life, she drew strength from the knowledge that this weapon had been carried by a man who understood the cost of standing up for what was right. Sheriff Morrison had spent the morning organizing their approach to the old mill ruins with the methodical precision of a military campaign. The abandoned flour mill sat in a shallow valley 2 miles east of town, its broken wheel and crumbling stone walls providing excellent defensive positions for anyone who controlled the high ground around it. Wheeler had chosen the location well. It was isolated enough to prevent unwanted witnesses, yet accessible enough for a quick escape if circumstances required it. "The key is positioning," Sheriff Morrison had explained as he sketched the mill's layout in the dirt outside Clara Mae's cabin. "Wheeler's expecting you to come alone, but he'll have men posted to watch for any tricks. We need to be in place before sunset, close enough to intervene, but hidden well enough to avoid detection." Elena had proven invaluable in planning their strategy, her experience with dangerous men providing insights that neither Clara Mae nor the sheriff possessed. She'd recognized immediately that Wheeler's ultimatum was designed to force them into a position of maximum vulnerability. Men like Wheeler, they never intend to honor their agreements, Elena had observed with the bitter wisdom of someone who'd learned such lessons the hard way. He wants the gold, see, but he also cannot afford to leave witnesses who might testify against him later. We must assume that he plans to kill us all, regardless of whether we bring what he demands. The harsh reality of Elena's assessment had forced Clara Mae to confront the possibility that their rescue attempt might cost not only her own life, but Samuel's as well. The weight of responsibility for her brother's fate had grown heavier with each passing hour, until Clara Mae had felt as though she were carrying stones in her chest. But the community of Willow Creek had rallied around them in ways that had surprised and moved Clara Mae deeply. Mrs. Patterson had arrived at their cabin that morning with a basket of food and a determination that brooked no argument. Sheriff Morrison had protested when Mrs. Patterson had announced her intention to participate in the rescue. "This is no place for what?" Mrs. Patterson had interrupted with the steel backbone that Clara Mae had always admired. "For a woman who's raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands. Sheriff, I've been dealing with dangerous men longer than you've been wearing that badge. Clara Mae and Samuel are like family to me. And family doesn't abandon family." Mary Sullivan had surprised them all by arriving with her father's hunting rifle and a quiet announcement that she'd grown up in rough country and knew how to use it. The schoolteacher's transformation from refined educator to determined ally had revealed depths of character that Clara Mae was still processing. "I came to Willow Creek to teach children," Mary had explained simply. "Samuel Morrison is one of my children, and no one hurts my children while I have breath in my body." Even Tommy Patterson had contributed to their preparations, though his role was limited to providing intelligence about the mill ruins. The 8-year-old had played around the abandoned building countless times, and his detailed knowledge of hidden passages and structural weaknesses had proven more valuable than any adult reconnaissance might have provided. "There's a hole in the back wall where the big stones fell down," Tommy had reported with the seriousness of a military scout. "It's too small for grown-ups, but Samuel could fit through it easy. And there's a place in the wheel housing where you can hear everything that happens inside the mill." The boys' information had given Clara Mae the first glimmer of hope she'd felt since discovering Samuel's abduction. If they could determine exactly where Wheeler was holding her brother, they might be able to coordinate a rescue that didn't require a direct frontal assault. But Clara Mae's decision to offer herself in exchange for Samuel had met with immediate and fierce opposition from every adult involved in the planning. "Absolutely not." Sheriff Morrison had declared when Clara Mae had proposed walking into the mill ruins alone, as Wheeler had demanded. That's exactly what Wheeler expects, and it plays directly into whatever trap he's prepared. Eleanor had been even more emphatic in her rejection of Clara Mae's sacrifice. "Nina, you think like a child who believes that good intentions will protect you from evil men. Wheeler will take both you and the gold, and Samuel will still die because dead witnesses cannot testify." The harsh truth of Elena's words had forced Clara Mae to abandon her romantic notions of heroic sacrifice in favor of more practical strategy. If they were going to save Samuel, they would need to outthink Wheeler rather than simply matching his willingness to use violence. Their final plan had been elegant in its complexity. Clara Mae would approach the mill ruins at the appointed time, carrying a decoy package that appeared to contain the Ortega gold. Sheriff Morrison and his hastily deputized volunteers would be positioned around the perimeter, ready to move on Clara Mae's signal. Elena, meanwhile, would attempt to locate and free Samuel using the back entrance that Tommy had described. But even the best plan required contingencies, and Clara Mae had spent the afternoon preparing for the possibility that everything might go wrong. She'd written letters to be delivered in case she didn't survive the confrontation, one to Uncle Ezra, formally transferring ownership of the lake property to Elena's family, and another to the territorial governor, describing Wheeler's criminal activities and the involvement of Rodrigo Ortega. Most difficult had been her letter to Samuel himself, a message she hoped he would never need to read, but felt compelled to write nonetheless. "Dear Samuel," she'd begun, the words blurring as tears had filled her eyes. "If you are reading this, it means that I was not as clever as I thought I was, and not as strong as I needed to be. But I want you to know that everything I did because I love you more than my own life. You are the best brother any sister could ask for, and you deserve a future filled with happiness and adventure." The letter had continued for several pages, containing advice, memories, and expressions of love that Clara Mae had never found the words to speak aloud. Writing it had been both heartbreaking and oddly liberating, forcing her to confront her own mortality while clarifying what truly mattered to her. As the sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, Clara Mae had found herself standing before the mirror in her parents' bedroom, studying the reflection of a young woman she barely recognized. The frightened 14-year-old who'd inherited a worthless lake just months earlier had been replaced by someone older, harder, and infinitely more determined. The transformation had been costly. She could see the loss of innocence in her own eyes, but it had also revealed strengths she'd never known she possessed. Elena had joined her for a final moment of preparation, adjusting the leather satchel that contained their carefully prepared decoy treasure. "Clara Mae," Elena had said softly, "I want you to know that your grandfather James would be proud of the woman you have become. He made a promise to my family, and you are keeping that promise even though it was never your burden to carry." The words had provided Clara Mae with a sense of connection to the larger story she'd found herself living. She wasn't just fighting for Samuel's life or their family's future. She was participating in a legacy of honor that stretched back generations, connecting her to ancestors she'd never met, but whose values she now carried forward. Sheriff Morrison had made his final check of weapons and positions, his weathered face grim with the knowledge that their makeshift posse was about to face professional killers. But when he looked at Clara Mae, she'd seen something in his expression that gave her courage. Not pity for a child forced into adult responsibilities, but respect for someone who'd proven herself worthy of it. "Miss Morrison," he'd said formally, "it's been an honor working with you. Whatever happens tonight, you should know that you've conducted yourself with courage and intelligence that would make any parent proud." As they'd prepared to leave for the mill ruins, Clara Mae had taken one last look at the lake that had started everything. The water reflected the dying sunlight like molten gold, beautiful and mysterious in the gathering dusk. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she knew that her childhood was ending by those cattail-lined shores. But if her sacrifice could save Samuel and honor the promises made by previous generations, Clara Mae Morrison was prepared to pay that price. The frightened girl who'd inherited a worthless lake was gone forever, replaced by a young woman ready to fight for what she believed was right. The storm lantern's yellow flame danced wildly in the evening breeze as Clara Mae approached the mill ruins, its light casting eerie shadows across the crumbling stone walls and broken machinery that had once ground grain for the entire territory. The abandoned mill looked like the skeleton of some ancient beast in the gathering darkness, its collapsed roof and scattered timbers creating a maze of potential hiding places and deadly traps. Wheeler emerged from the shadows near the old mill wheel, his tall figure backlit by the lantern he carried, making him appear more like a specter than a man. Two other figures flanked him, the hard-faced gunmen Clara Mae had observed from a distance, their hands resting casually on their weapons in a gesture that managed to be both relaxed and threatening. "Miss Morrison," Wheeler called out, his voice echoing strangely off the stone walls. "I'm pleased to see that you value your brother's life more than your pride." I was beginning to worry that frontier stubbornness might override family loyalty. Clara Mae forced herself to walk steadily forward, the leather satchel containing their decoy treasure clutched tightly in her left hand, while her right remained free to reach for her father's revolver if necessary. Every step brought her closer to the point of no return, but she could see no sign of Samuel among the ruins. "Where is my brother?" she demanded, stopping just beyond the reach of Wheeler's lantern light. "You said you'd bring him if I brought the gold." Wheeler's smile was visible even in the dim light, cold and calculating as a snake's. "Oh, the boy is quite safe, I assure you. But surely you understand that business negotiations require a certain degree of insurance. Let me see what you've brought before we discuss the specific terms of our exchange." The demand had been expected, but Clara Mae's heart still raced as she opened the satchel and displayed its contents. Elena had been clever in preparing the decoy. Real gold coins mixed with brass pieces that would pass casual inspection, jewelry that looked valuable in poor light, and documents that appeared authentic without revealing anything truly important. Wheeler stepped closer, his lantern casting new patterns of light and shadow across the ruins. Behind him, Clara Mae could see movement in the deeper darkness, more men than she'd expected, positioned to prevent any escape attempt. Very impressive, Wheeler acknowledged after a cursory examination of the decoy treasure. Though I suspect this represents only a small portion of what the Ortega family actually hid. No matter, it's enough to begin more serious negotiations. The words sent a chill through Clara Mae's spine. Wheeler's casual mention of more serious negotiations suggested that he never intended to honor their agreement. Elena had been right about his true intentions. "I've brought what you asked for," Clara Mae said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Now show me Samuel and let us leave." Wheeler's laugh was genuinely amused, as if Clara Mae had told an unexpectedly clever joke. "My dear Miss Morrison, I'm afraid the situation has evolved beyond such simple arrangements. You see, I've recently learned some fascinating details about your family's history and your current associates." The lantern light suddenly revealed Samuel, bound and gagged, but apparently unharmed, sitting against one of the mill's stone supports. His eyes were wide with fear, but Clara Mae could see the intelligence in his gaze. He was observing everything, waiting for his chance to act. But Wheeler's next revelation struck Clara Mae like a physical blow. From the shadows behind the mill wheel stepped a figure she recognized, Uncle Ezra. His expensive city clothes incongruous in the ruins, his familiar face wearing an expression she'd never seen before. "Hello." "Clara Mae," Uncle Ezra said, his voice carrying a mixture of regret and determination. "I'm sorry it had to come to this, but children sometimes force adults to make difficult decisions for their own good." The betrayal hit Clara Mae harder than any physical violence could have. Uncle Ezra hadn't simply been working with Wheeler. He'd been orchestrating the entire situation, using his knowledge of the family's history and his legal authority as their guardian to manipulate events from the beginning. "You knew," Clara Mae whispered, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. "You knew about Grandfather James and the Ortega gold. You've known all along." Uncle Ezra nodded with what might have been genuine sadness. "My father told me the story before he died, how he'd helped Carlos Ortega hide his family's treasure, how he'd promised to protect it until the rightful owners could return. But James Morrison died with that promise unfulfilled, and I inherited both the secret and the moral burden." Wheeler stepped forward impatiently, his tolerance for family revelations clearly limited. "Touching as this reunion may be, we have business to conclude. Miss Morrison, you and your brother are going to help us recover the rest of the Ortega treasure, all of it." And then, his words were cut off by the sharp crack of a rifle shot from the darkness beyond the ruins. One of Wheeler's gunmen spun and fell, clutching his shoulder and cursing viciously. Sheriff Morrison's voice rang out from the night, amplified by the stone walls. "Jake Wheeler, you're under arrest for kidnapping and extortion. Release the children and surrender your weapons." The mill ruins erupted into chaos as Wheeler's men scattered for cover, their lanterns creating wild patterns of light and shadow as they tried to locate their attackers. Clara Mae threw herself towards Samuel, desperate to reach him before the shooting started in earnest, but Wheeler's hand closed on her arm with iron strength, dragging her back toward the deeper shadows of the mill's interior. "Not so fast, Miss Morrison. The evening is just beginning." Elena's family cross caught the muzzle flash of gunfire as she emerged from the hole in the mill's back wall that Tommy Patterson had described, the silver crucifix gleaming briefly before she pressed herself against the stone interior. The sacred symbol had been passed down through 4 generations of Ortega women, carried through wars and exile, and now it seemed to guide Elena through the darkness toward the sound of Samuel's muffled struggles. Clara Mae felt Wheeler's grip tighten on her arm as he dragged her deeper into the mill's shadowed interior. using her as a human shield, while his men returned fire against Sheriff Morrison's positions. The confined space amplified every gunshot into a deafening roar, and the acrid smell of black powder smoke made her eyes water. "Your sheriff friend has made a serious tactical error," Wheeler shouted over the gunfire, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and professional assessment. "He's brought farmers and shopkeepers to fight men who kill for a living. This won't end well for anyone." But Wheeler had underestimated the determination of people fighting to protect their community. Mrs. Patterson's rifle spoke from a position near the mill race, her shot chipping stone inches from Wheeler's head. Mary Sullivan's voice rang out from another direction, clear and commanding despite the chaos. "Samuel, can you hear me? We're coming for you!" The school teacher's words seemed to galvanize Samuel into action. Despite being bound, he managed to roll away from the stone support where Wheeler had left him, using the confusion of the firefight to inch toward the darker recesses of the mill where Elena was approaching. Clara Mae seized the moment of Wheeler's distraction to break free from his grip, but Uncle Ezra caught her before she could reach Samuel. Her uncle's face was pale with fear and regret, but his hands remained firm as he held her. "Clara Mae, please," Uncle Ezra pleaded, his voice barely audible over the continuing gunfire. "This wasn't supposed to happen. Wheeler promised there wouldn't be violence if you cooperated. You believed a man like that?" Clara Mae demanded, struggling against her uncle's grip. "You put Samuel in danger because you trusted a killer's word?" Uncle Ezra's response was cut off by Elena's sudden appearance in the mill's interior. The Mexican woman moved with deadly purpose, a knife gleaming in her hand as she cut Samuel's bonds with swift, efficient strokes. The family cross around her neck caught the light as she helped the boy to his feet. "Samuel, stay close to me," Elena commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death situations. "We're going to get you out of here." But Wheeler had noticed Elena's presence and was turning to confront this new threat when Samuel did something that surprised everyone. Instead of following Elena toward safety, the 10-year-old boy launched himself at Uncle Ezra, his small fists striking with surprising effectiveness. "You betrayed us," Samuel shouted, his young voice cracking with emotion. "Papa trusted you and you betrayed us." The unexpected attack caught Uncle Ezra off balance, and his grip on Clara Mae loosened enough for her to break free. She immediately drew her father's revolver, the weight of the Civil War-era weapon familiar in her hands from hours of practice. Wheeler spun toward the sound of Samuel's voice, his own pistol rising, but Elena was faster. Her knife flew through the air with practiced accuracy, embedding itself in Wheeler's gun hand and sending his weapon spinning away into the darkness. "You want to fight children and women?" Elena snarled, advancing on the wounded Wheeler with the fury of generations of injustice behind her. "Let's see how you fare against someone who fights back." The tide of battle had turned decisively. Wheeler's remaining men, finding themselves outflanked and outnumbered by determined townspeople who knew every inch of the surrounding terrain, began to surrender rather than face certain death. Sheriff Morrison appeared in the mill's entrance, his badge gleaming in the lantern light as he surveyed the scene with grim satisfaction. "Jake Wheeler, you're under arrest for kidnapping, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder." But the most dramatic moment came when Clara Mae confronted Uncle Ezra, her father's revolver steady in her young hands, despite the emotional turmoil she felt. "Why?" she asked simply, the single word carrying all the hurt and betrayal of the evening's revelations. Uncle Ezra's shoulders sagged as if the weight of his guilt had finally become unbearable. "The Ortega treasure isn't just gold, Clara Mae. It's worth enough to change everything, to make our family wealthy beyond imagination. I thought I could recover it quietly, share it with Rodrigo Ortega as the moral thing to do, and still provide for you and Samuel." Elena stepped forward, her dark eyes blazing with righteous anger. "Rodrigo Ortega is my uncle, and he cares nothing for morality. He hired Wheeler to steal what belongs to my family, and you helped him. The admission completed Clara Mae's understanding of the complex betrayals that had endangered their lives. Uncle Ezra hadn't been motivated by simple greed, but by a misguided attempt to balance moral obligation with family advancement. His good intentions had nearly gotten them all killed. Samuel, now free and defiant, delivered the final judgment on Uncle Ezra's actions with the clear moral vision that only children possess. "Papa always said that doing the right thing is simple, even when it's hard," Samuel declared, his young voice cutting through the adult's complicated justifications. "You just have to choose what's right instead of what's easy." The wisdom of a 10-year-old boy had laid bare the fundamental truth that all the adults had somehow lost sight of in their complex schemes and moral compromises. The new deed bore both their names in elegant script: the Clara Mae Morrison Elena Martinez Trust, a legal document that represented far more than simple property ownership. 6 months after the confrontation at the mill ruins, Clara Mae held the papers that established their partnership not just as a business arrangement, but as a bridge between two families whose destinies had been intertwined for generations. Spring had transformed the lake property in ways that seemed almost magical to Clara Mae, where once cattails and stagnant water had created an impression of worthless swampland. Careful management had revealed the natural beauty that her grandfather James Morrison and Carlos Ortega had recognized decades earlier. Elena's knowledge of her family's original land use, combined with Clara Mae's inherited understanding of the soil and water, had created something neither could have achieved alone. The lake itself ran clearer now, its water sparkling in the morning sunlight as Samuel cast his fishing line from the new dock they'd built together. At 11 years old, her brother had grown taller and more confident, but he'd retained the curiosity and moral clarity that had proven so crucial during their darkest hours. The wooden horse their father had carved for him now sat on the mantelpiece in their expanded cabin, a reminder of simpler times and the enduring power of family love. "Clara Mae," Samuel called out from the dock, his voice carrying easily across the water. "Elena says the new families from Mexico City will be arriving next week. Are we ready for them?" Clara Mae smiled as she watched her brother's easy interaction with their transformed surroundings. The lake property had become the heart of a small but thriving community. Mexican families who'd accepted Elena's invitation to return to their ancestral lands, working alongside longtime Willow Creek residents who'd embraced the economic opportunities that careful development had created. Elena emerged from the restored ranch house that now served as both her home and the community's unofficial headquarters. The building had been constructed using traditional Mexican architectural techniques, but with modern improvements that made it comfortable for families from both cultures. Her dark hair was streaked with early gray, a consequence, she claimed, of the stress of managing their complex enterprise, but her eyes held the satisfaction of someone who'd seen justice finally served. "The families are eager to begin planting," Elena reported, settling into the chair beside Clara Mae on the porch they'd added to overlook the lake. "And the territorial government has officially recognized our land grants. After 70 years, my family's claim to Rancho Agua Clara is legally restored." The legal resolution had taken months of careful negotiation, but the outcome had satisfied everyone, except those who'd tried to steal what wasn't theirs. Elena's family had regained legal title to their ancestral lands, while Clara Mae had retained ownership of the specific parcels her father had legally purchased. Their partnership trust had been designed to honor both claims while creating something larger than either could have achieved individually. Mrs. Patterson approached from the direction of town. Her weekly basket of baked goods balanced easily despite her advancing years. At 73, Eleanor Patterson had become the unofficial grandmother of their expanded community, her practical wisdom and generous heart helping to bridge cultural differences that might otherwise have created conflict. "How are our young entrepreneurs today?" Mrs. Patterson asked with the affectionate teasing that had become her trademark. I heard that the latest shipment of crafts to Kansas City sold out completely. The craft cooperative had been Elena's idea, a way for the Mexican families to market their traditional handiwork to buyers in larger cities while maintaining their cultural traditions. Clara Mae had contributed her father's surveying skills and her mother's careful record-keeping, creating a business that provided steady income while preserving heritage crafts that might otherwise have been lost. Mary Sullivan appeared from the schoolhouse they'd built near the lake's eastern shore, leading a group of children from both Mexican and American families. The school teacher had embraced her expanded role as educator for a truly multicultural community, teaching lessons in both English and Spanish while helping children from different backgrounds learn to work and play together. "Miss Morrison," Mary called out, using the formal address she maintained in front of her students. "The children have finished their letters to the territorial governor, thanking him for supporting our community development project." The letters were part of Mary's ongoing effort to teach civic responsibility alongside traditional subjects. The children's correspondence with government officials had proven surprisingly effective in building political support for their unusual experiment in cross-cultural cooperation. Sheriff Morrison rode up the path from town, his weekly visit to check on their community's progress having become as much social call as official duty. The lawman had become something of a local hero after the events at the mill ruins, his careful handling of the Wheeler affair having earned respect throughout the territory. "Ladies," the sheriff greeted them with the courtly manner that had made him popular with voters, "I bring news from the territorial capital. Jake Wheeler and his associates have been sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. Uncle Ezra received 5 years for his part in the conspiracy, though the judge noted his cooperation in recovering the stolen property. The news brought a sense of closure that Clara Mae had been seeking for months. Justice had been served, the treasure had been restored to its rightful owners, and the community had learned to thrive despite the challenges they'd faced. But the most satisfying development had been personal. The partnership with Elena had evolved into something that felt like family. 2 women from different cultures and generations who'd discovered that they shared values that transcended their surface differences. Elena's knowledge of the land's history, combined with Clara Mae's inherited understanding of its potential, had created a legacy that honored both their ancestors and their descendants. As the sun set over the lake that had started everything, Clara Mae reflected on how completely their world had changed. The worthless inheritance had revealed its true value, not in buried gold, but in the community it had brought together. Samuel's discovery of the treasure had been the beginning of their adventure, but the real treasure had been the relationships and the sense of purpose they'd built together. "Clara Mae," Samuel said as he returned from the dock with his evening catch, "do you think Papa and Mama would be proud of what we've done?" She looked around at the thriving community, the restored lake, and the faces of people who'd become family through choice rather than blood. Thomas and Sarah Morrison had left their children more than land. They'd left them the wisdom to recognize that true wealth came from building something larger than themselves. "I think they'd be very proud," Clara Mae replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned to trust her own judgment. "We kept their promises, and we built something beautiful." The lake reflected the evening stars like scattered diamonds, and Clara Mae Morrison knew that she was finally home.